Father Casey, are you in a cult? Believe it or not, this was a question that one of my students asked me just a few months ago. And while I dismissed the question then and still hold that I am not in a cult, my desire to answer this question honestly and objectively did leave me with a somewhat unsettling answer. You see, I was teaching a senior seminar called Faith in the Modern World, an opportunity to look at religion in a post-scientific world to see why people still believe in God and how even new religions are popping up. We were doing a unit on cults, looking at groups like Heaven's Gates, the Branch Davidians, the People's Temple, you know, the who's who of crazies. And one of the students bluntly shared that a friend of his was actually in a cult. My interest was piqued, so I asked him to explain. Turns out he was just in a very strict religious order in the Catholic Church, not a cult. We looked up the specific group and found that they adhered to extreme poverty, prayed all day long, had little contact with family, and mostly refrained from using the internet or watching television. As you can imagine, the entire class of 17-year-olds were convinced that it was a cult, but it wasn't. Having lived as a friar for nearly 10 years, having built up a relationship with these students for more than 2, I tried to appeal to their familiarity with me to convince them otherwise. Guys, you know that that's not that different from the way I live, right? We take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. We let someone else tell us where we live and what we do. We have to ask permission to travel. We wear the same thing as everyone else in the community, pray multiple times a day. That's sort of the life of any religious, actually. Hence the question. Father Casey, are you in a cult? What's interesting about this question is that I didn't have an answer right away. To me, it just seemed intuitive, so clearly off base that I was kind of taken aback. Of course I'm not in a cult. I'm a Franciscan, a member of the Catholic Church. We've been around for 800 years. For someone like me, that was a sufficient enough answer. But to a room of high schoolers, to a group of people that may or may not have any religious faith themselves, it wasn't intuitive. Being around for 800 years just means that you're successful, not that you're not a cult. Being a part of the Catholic Church, given its storied history of secrecy and collusion, isn't exactly a strong defense for this generation. What I needed was a clear definition, objective criteria that could distinguish cults from religions. As you can imagine, this is easier said than done.
So today I want to talk about cults.
Okay.
Would you want to be a part of a group that wears the same thing every single day for the rest of their lives?
I don't know, that's kind of hard. Like, I guess it would depend on what I'm wearing.
So what is a cult?
People who live in an extreme fashion and worship one being, whether it be a living being like a human being or an animal or any like deity.
It's like a group of like alienated people looking for a community under like one person who's like super charismatic, super like seemingly giving and stuff like that. I know the line is like blurred like all the time.
I would say a group of like-minded people that follow a strict set of orders.
For me, a cult is more like something that I guess would reject like social constructs, or like it was not acceptable in social terms.
What would you think about a life where someone tells you where to live and who to live with, what job you're gonna do, you have to turn all your money over to this one person, you all wear the same thing all the time, and you have a strong devotion to this person?
Oh yeah, that's a cult. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it personally.
No.
Kind of like similar things that you just described, I would say describe a cult really well.
Okay.
I guess it's different for each cult, I guess, with their values.
So what's the difference between a cult and a religion?
Honestly, I've thought about that. I feel like there's not a lot of difference in some cases. So it could be considered a cult, but I guess cult often has a negative connotation to it, whereas religion has a positive connotation.
I was born and raised Christian, and like, you know, growing up, I definitely, you know, felt some similarities with like offerings and tithes and stuff. So like, yeah, I can totally see the connection. Like, you know, the line is very blurred between like, you know, religion, like Christianity and like cultism to me.
Now, in my conversations with people, it was clear that most knew exactly what a cult was until they had to define it, until they had to distinguish it from a religion. Their knowledge was intuitive, a sort of sense of things, but it didn't form into a coherent or objective argument. I believe that there are 4 reasons for this, 3 of which we can all agree on, and one that, as I said before, has left me a bit unsettled since I realized it. The first problem, quite obviously, is that this is a highly complex topic that requires a nuanced, precise response. Asking someone in front of the class, putting people on the spot on camera, is not going to give the precision or detail that we need. To say that a cult is a group of people devoted to a charismatic leader is technically true, but as is, this definition also includes political parties, social clubs, sports teams, and boy bands, which, for the most part, are not cults. A more precise definition might say that a cult is an organization defined by a charismatic leader that claims to have divine qualities, asserts complete authority, and expects unbridled reverence. That is a much clearer definition. And while it doesn't completely absolve all political parties, social clubs, sports teams, or boy bands, it does show that simply having a charismatic leader is not enough, and how there might be a difference between the way that most religions operate and what we would call a cult. While there is no definitive list, social sciences tend to agree that there are a number of other qualities just like this that might help us define what we mean. Because charismatic leaders base his or her authority on private revelations, cult leaders are often treated as speaking infallibly. Everything they say is correct and their word overrides any other sources because who are we going to challenge? As such, there is no room for questioning or doubting this authority, no matter how illogical or unverifiable it may be, as the leader possesses secret knowledge that no other member can verify or refute. Because most cults exist separate from and against the world, little is ever done to engage with people outside of the group other than to maintain and increase one's numbers. Works of charity and justice, attempts to improve the world, are almost entirely non-existent. Personal freedom within the group is extremely limited, and almost all forms of individuality are suppressed. Forced conformity, severing ties with the outside world, and various types of abuse serve to erode any sense of personal autonomy and worth. And finally, there is no way that members can leave in good standing, if at all. Shame, coercion, even violence are used to keep members from leaving. In general, what you see is an organization strictly rooted in a single individual, expecting conformity of mind and action, engaging in strict asceticism, and renouncing much of the world. Which, as a working definition, gets us much closer to the answer than we were before, but also presents us with another problem. Are all of these qualities bad all the time? While we can all imagine each of these qualities to their worst degree, there's no denying that what I've just described could loosely be applied to organizations that none of us would call a cult. Hence, problem 2, failing to understand intention.
What would you think of a life where someone gives up all their money, they wear the same thing each and every day as everyone else as well, they have their mind changed on things, they don't have families and they're kind of cut off from their families? Would that be a cult?
I don't know, as long as it's just benefiting the general morale of everyone else, then I don't see a problem with it, but I guess it could be considered a cult. Yeah.
Okay, because what I've just described is basically Mother Teresa. You know, like, would you consider Mother Teresa in a cult?
Oh my gosh, no. No, I wouldn't.
So why
at
not?
all.
What would be the difference between her and someone in a cult?
I think that's a great comparison. I couldn't find, I think Mother Teresa is like the exact opposite of evil, and cults are associated with evil, so.
Could you give a reason, objective thing, like a list? What would make the difference between Mother Teresa and a cult? How would you define that?
The difference between Mother Teresa and a cult. I can't think of anything like off the top of my head. I don't know. I'm not even gonna try and answer that. I don't think I have a good enough answer.
It's true that cults and religions might in fact require its members to renounce their financial assets in order to live simply. But why? Is this in order to free adherents from corrupt economies, to live in solidarity with the poor, and to find happiness in the little things? Or is it a way to make people entirely dependent on a single all-powerful ruler? Surely, there is a difference between the missionaries of charity and NXIVM. It's true that many members of both religions and cults become detached from friends and family members. But why? Is this the natural result of a change in lifestyle, living further away and having fewer opportunities to travel? Or is it the active goal of a group to erode all ties with the outside world so as to make people easier to manipulate and control? Clearly, there is a difference between joining a Trappist monastery and the Branch Davidians. And it's true that many members of both religions and cults become one in mind, able to recite the exact same teachings and core beliefs. But why? Is this because free, like-minded people have come to share in the same values after a period of questioning? Or because people are forced to memorize doctrines and are afraid to raise any doubts? Obviously, there is a difference between the Girl Scouts and Heaven's Gate. As with almost any action, the external expression is far less important than the reason for the action. When we try to distinguish between a cult and a religion, really a cult in any fervent group that shapes its members, it is critical that we understand what is behind the action. Even people who are not religious recognize that physical asceticism can actually be emotionally and spiritually nourishing. People go on diets and cleanses all the time. Occasionally giving up one's autonomy and conforming to the wishes of others is essential for any lasting relationship. Ask any married couple. And being critical of the world and seeking something higher is not crazy. It's probably what we should all be doing right now. Have you watched the news lately? When you compare religions with cults, it is inevitable that there are going to be a lot of similarities in practice. Thus, the focus shouldn't be on whether they do the same things. It should be on why they do them. That's where the differences become clearer. And yet, these very differences can cause us some confusion at other times, particularly when groups that we instinctively call cults turn out to be very different from one another. Hence problem number 3, that our definitions become too strict and inflexible. While the list of 6 criteria are generally true for cults and serve as a good launching off point, they are just that, generalities. Some groups fit all 6 categories, while others may only have 2. Does that mean that they're not a cult? This is where things start to get a little cloudy. Saul B. Newton never claimed to be God, to have any special revelation, or demanded reverence or absolute authority. He did, however, run a polyamorous institute of several hundred people, encouraging members to sever ties with family members and give up their children. Everything about that says cult. Family International is an organization that has outlasted its founder by nearly 30 years and espouses no supernatural beliefs, but is accused of sexually abusing children, using violence against insubordinate members, and being preoccupied with raising money. Compare these two to Heaven's Gate, a group so committed to asceticism that all of its members were castrated. They believed that an extraterrestrial spacecraft was going to take them to a new kingdom, and the entire group committed suicide as they waited. If that ain't a cult, I don't know what is. Surely these are widely diverse groups, and not one of them checks all 6 boxes. And yet everything about them screams cult. Who could possibly look at any one of them and say that it is a healthy, normal religion? Surely not. In trying to distinguish between cults and religions, we can sometimes get caught up on the fact that there is no one category that applies to every cult, that there's no definitive quality. But that doesn't mean that there aren't religious expressions that are just bad, general qualities that reveal distortion, that are detrimental to the human person, that are harmful to society, that are built on logical fallacies that don't stand up to scrutiny. Just because there is no ironclad set of criteria doesn't mean that there aren't good religious practices and bad ones. There certainly are. Which, unfortunately, leads us to our final problem and the most unsettling part of this question. The distinction between religions and cults is far more fluid than it is binary. While we often talk about religions and cults as separate, distinct phenomena, the reality is that there isn't a fundamental difference between a cult and a religion. When atheists say that a cult is nothing more than a religion we don't like, it's kind of true. The problem is that no one claims to be in a cult. There are no cult apologists out there helping to define the word. When we call something a cult, we're simply using a derogatory term to mean bad religion, something that possesses qualities that are physically, emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually damaging. It's not like we have religions over here as pure, righteous organizations of truth that produce nothing but good things, and cults over here as wholly evil, monstrous organizations of pain and lives over here, with an insurmountable chasm in between. No. What we're talking about is a gradation, a continuum, a recognition that there are good, holy, and virtuous aspects of some so-called cults, and there can even be some dangerous, abusive, and cult-like aspects of some religions. Just because someone is a part of an established religious order in the Catholic Church, even the church at large, doesn't mean that they are free from leaders that abuse their power, demanding too much from their people. Even religions with long traditions can promote irrational policies, insulate themselves from any sort of positive mission, and become preoccupied with worldly things. There can most certainly be aspects of abuse, secrecy, shame, and hypocrisy, and that wouldn't, in itself, make it a cult. It would make it unhealthy. It would make it toxic. It would undermine the supposed mission of the church, but it wouldn't make it a cult. And so, no, I can say pretty confidently that I am not in a cult. Franciscans are an order established with sound principles devoted to peace and justice, promoting the holistic health of all of its members. It is not a cult. But I also don't think that that's the right question we should be asking. When asked if I thought that this student's friend was in a cult, I quickly dismissed the question because I was thinking in entirely black and white terms. But I wonder now if that was wise. I wonder if this student's intuition wasn't actually onto something, that he sensed something unhealthy, something corrupt beneath the protection of its history and tradition. In reality, it probably wasn't a cult, but that doesn't mean that it's not above reproach either. There are cult-like groups within the Catholic Church. There are cult-like tendencies even in great organizations. And so instead of asking if I'm in a cult, a question that should not be taken seriously by anyone, what we should all be asking is whether or not our religion bears any cult-like aspects to it. Are we susceptible in some way? Are there tendencies here or there? Are there forms of power or abuse that are a result of human defect and not God's will? Tough to say. Tough to ask, honestly, but important. I never expected to be asked if I was in a cult, but I much less expected to see that at times I might be. Rather than dismiss it as a foolish question, I believe that it would serve every religious person well to ask from time to time if it is such a foolish question. Far better to admit that you have a small problem than to wake up one day and realize that you are in a full-fledged cult.